Hello and welcome back. I'm Professor Young, and today we're going to get acquainted with ancient Greece. But first, today's big question: why are we so fascinated by monsters and heroes? This is a trait we share with the ancient Greeks. Just look at the popularity of superheroes and action films today. But what is it about them that we love? What do the heroes represent? Could it be that heroes represent what we wish we were? How we might be if we were being our very best? And what about monsters or villains? What might they represent? Could they be ciphers for our fears or the worst parts of ourselves? It's interesting to think about how seemingly fantastic narratives might reveal something about humanity. And as you'll see, exploring humanity was one of ancient Greece's favorite pastimes. So, just to give you a general outline, today we'll work to understand the historical and philosophical context of early Greece. Then we'll try to discern how this context shapes cultural values, and we'll also examine Greek artifacts for distinct cultural expression. And while we're doing all of this, you might consider how Greece has been an influence on Western culture, and how some of the ways they thought are still the ways we think today. So let's talk a little about the personality of Greece. First things first, looking at this map, you can see that the territory is made up of a number of islands and a few seaside mainland areas. The mainland areas are rugged and mountainous, so while many places were accessible by sea, the terrain of the mainland made other places hard to reach. In many cases, there were no navigable rivers, so in general, the geography of Greece prevents unification. But that's not to say we can't generally speak to Greek character. Overall, Greeks were self assured and confident. They had lots of pride in Greece, so Greece was better than everywhere else. And within ancient Greek civilization, there were many, many different polis. A polis is a city state. So here, smaller collections of civilization made up a greater Greek whole. You've heard this word polis before, as it's one of the roots for the word metropolis, which means mother city. Each of these polis had some form of civilization going for them. They had urban centers and technological development, and each was political. That is, they were concerned with the matters of the polis. In fact, even though these different areas identified with one another, they were more proud of their polis identity. So you can imagine it's a bit like how Texas is. Sure, we like the USA and its values, but Texas more strongly identifies with unique Texan culture. Nonetheless, in general, Greeks are optimistic about human ability. They're humanists and they uphold a concept called arete. This is the idea that one should be the very best they can be. And this comes out in not just the developments of the individual, but also the development of the city state. In fact, one of the requirements of being one's best is to be involved in politics. That is, as long as you were a citizen, meaning you were free, native, and male. And in ancient Greece, everyone's okay with slavery. A reliance upon slave labor gave Greeks time to think and create and advance, or to be their very best. And naturally, Greeks were very competitive. You can't determine what the best is unless it's competing against something or someone else, right? We've all heard of the famous competition, the Olympics. When they began, they were a celebration for the gods, but they were also a place for people to compete and show all of Greece that they were the best. Men and only men competed here, and there weren't really prizes, but a polis could certainly win bragging rights. Polis would compete in the Olympics, they would compete for resources in the rough terrain, and they would compete for military might and artistic prowess too. Also, as evidenced by the Olympic festivities for the gods, the Greeks were very religious, and their religion is shared through stories and myths that vary in each region. There's no central text that anyone might refer to, and this made it so that myths could be combined and added on to. Demigods are added to promote individual polis identities, and the patron deities of cities may have stories outlining their special relationship with the region. Even though their stories may have small differences, religion is a big deal in ancient Greece, and it's one of the things that brings people together. Greece has religious sanctuaries that are neutral and for everyone, and at these they'd host symposiums where Greeks from all of the polis could share arts and ideas. Delphi is perhaps the most famous of these. Average people were allowed in, and rituals were public. In fact, it's part of their civic duty. In ancient Greece, the gods had human characteristics, and there were gods of every temperament. In fact, sometimes the gods are a little too human. Often, Greek gods can't take jokes, they're sex crazed, they throw temper tantrums, and they can be selfish and immoral. What does this tell us about ancient Greece? While their gods were not always good examples of morality, some of them did have some fine talents, and within this spectrum of deities, the Greeks saw lots of shades of gray. There was really no supreme good or supreme evil. Instead, the gods were used to explain their world and to explore their own human successes and failures. Oh, and in Greece, there is an afterlife, and the place the dead go to is called Hades. This is both the name for the underworld and the name for the god of the underworld. When you die, you get to Hades by crossing the river Styx. And in the beginning, the Greek afterlife was actually kind of boring. I mean, I kind of imagine it like a giant waiting room where nothing particularly interesting is happening, and you have to rely upon your living family members and friends to remember you and bring you offerings. Later, myths spice this up by dividing the afterlife into realms. Elysium is the good place, Asphodel Meadows is the neutral place, and Tartarus is the bad place. Generally, though, death is not celebrated or strived for. While there are numerous temples for other major Greek gods, there are few to no temples to Hades. And here's a list of the Olympians, the gods that the Olympics are meant to glorify. You don't have to remember them, but just seeing them and their responsibilities should give you some insight into Greek interests. Perhaps you notice that nature features much less prominently here. What does it seem like Greeks are interested in instead? Also, it's interesting to note that ancient Greek gods are not eternal. Olympians are just the latest dynasty. In fact, a few of the Olympians are children of Kronos. Kronos was a titan, and titans, who are primitive, colossal, and chaotic, are more closely associated with nature as they are the children of the earth god and the sky god. Now, Kronos has his own sordid family history. He and his siblings overthrew their father, and when Kronos receives a prophecy that he'll be overthrown by his own offspring, he decides to destroy his children and preserve his power. But it doesn't go quite as he'd planned, and it was such a simple plan. He decided that he'd prevent his kids from ousting him by eating them as soon as they were born. So each time his wife popped out a baby, he'd gulp it down and solve all his problems. But there were a couple of hitches. First, the devoured children didn't die. They continued to live and grow in his stomach. Remember, they're gods and he's a titan, so this is entirely possible. Also, Kronos got so good at eating his kids that he didn't even notice when his wife Rhea served up a stone wrapped in a blanket instead of the baby Zeus. Baby Zeus was then hidden away, and when he grew up, he challenged his father. A giant battle ensued, and it's rumored that it is this battle between these formidable forces that formed the rugged, mountainous terrain of Greece. In the end, Zeus won. In one version of the story, he poisons Kronos, and as a result, Kronos vomits up Zeus's siblings. In another version, Zeus slices open his father's stomach and releases them, but either way, the prophecy is fulfilled and the siblings divvy up the godly responsibilities once they're in charge. In this story, we learn a little bit about the gods' origins, but if you think about it, we also learn how the Greeks feel about old, primitive ways versus newer, more civilized interests. And like religion, art also reflects an interest in humanity, in polis pride, and in change and improvement. Early on, Greece expressed these interests in pottery, sculpture, and architecture. Unlike Egypt, there was no standardized form here. Instead, art reflects the personalities of the polis. It evidences changes in Greek culture, and Greece's changing interests and influences are played out differently in the styles of each age and each region. Chronologically, art in early Greece falls into three ages: the Heroic Age, the Age of Colonization, and the Archaic period. Each has a distinct expression, and very often one polis or another seems to really make that expression shine. The Heroic Age is so named because it's when Homer's epics were written. In this period, Greece had limited contact with outsiders, and their art is pretty simple in its form and function. Often, this art features geometric forms and linear designs, and this is also when they begin to incorporate the maze or meander pattern that becomes a prominent feature in Greek arts. You may recognize it as even today it's still a feature on menus in Greek restaurants. Next comes the age of colonization. This is when city states become prosperous, trade flourishes, and Greek crafts and goods are popular commodities. But with prosperity comes population, and overpopulation becomes a problem. Because of this, the Greeks decide to colonize, and they set up shop in Italy, in Egypt, and in areas around the Black Sea. When they do this, they take the culture of the polis with them, but this is also when many new ideas and styles are brought into Greece, and we see Orientalized pottery or pottery with an Eastern influence and design. Finally, there's the Archaic period, and in this period, artists are experimenting with concepts related to humanity and the human form. Art in this era is meant to tell stories and show off the best and most interesting aspects of humanity. Now, as it is not specifically tied to any one polis, the art of the Heroic Age is a good place to start. And what we see in the arts is geometric intricacy in things like this amphora. If you look closely, you can see that the amphora includes line work and it features the meander or maze pattern. Perhaps more interesting is the fact that this work includes human forms, and though they are not at all realistic, they still demonstrate an early Greek interest in humanity. So, looking closely, what do you think is going on here? If you guessed a funeral, you're right. There's a depiction of a dead person and mourners in the central band, and there's also emotion in this one. It looks like the mourners are not just preparing the dead, but they're also raising their arms, wailing and grieving. In fact, these amphoras were large and they sometimes served as grave markers. This one is 4 feet 11 inches high. They're left at grave sites and they provide a place for mourners to leave offerings for the dead. This is so the dead don't get cranky in that big old waiting area. So that's a little bit about early arts, but the later eras are more fun to associate with particular Greek city states. So let's talk a little about them. We'll start with Athens. Athens' early government is an oligarchy, and the ruling aristocracy are called tyrants. They're called this before the word has a negative connotation, but later they're also the guys that give it that negative connotation. When things go south with the tyrants, Athens adopts a democracy and a general assembly of, you guessed it, free men gets to vote on the affairs of the polis. In addition to that cool democracy thing they developed, Athens was also well situated geographically. They had a hilltop acropolis which made their polis easier to defend and gave them access to sea and land. They were pretty strong traders, and their naval forces were state of the art. And speaking of defense and military, most Greek cities didn't have standing armies. Instead, they relied on hoplites, or men ages 18 to 60, who served as needed. And often these guys had day jobs as farmers and merchants, and they fought to defend the lives they were building in the city. Athens' military was this sort of setup. All around, Athens is interested in improvement and intellect as they were constantly striving to show off humanistic ideals and achievements. Athens is where we see the developments of great Greek philosophers and dramatists interested in exploring human motivation and human potential. And it's here that we see artists creating works that express an interest in humanity too. Early Athenian sculptors created figures called choros. Looking at this first one, we can see the influence of ancient Egypt. The figure is stiff with his arms at his sides, but there are also major differences here. For one, this figure is nude, and this reflects the Greek interest in the ideal human form, specifically the male form. Men were afforded more rights in ancient Greek culture, and male warriors and athletes were revered for their displays of arete. So these guys were those that were most depicted in the Koro statues. There are also kore or female figures, but they're clothed and they often serve as votive statues, attending and providing offerings to the Greek gods. We can see that as their skills improved, so did the image of the ideal male. This later Koros was created to honor a warrior who died in battle, and he shows off the Athenian interest in human perfection via ideal anatomy and achievement. Likewise, this interest in humanity shows up in Athenian vase painting. Red and black figure painting was popular in Greece, and Athens was especially good at creating those vases that depicted Greek myths and histories. This one is called Death of Sarpedon, and it attempts a more naturalistic depiction of the human form while also evoking human emotion. Here, Zeus's son Sarpedon is depicted having just been killed in the Trojan War. And even though he's a hero and a demigod, he too fights and suffers for humanity. His body is idealized in careful attention to detail, but his figure lies naturalistically limp as he's overcome by his wounds and carried away by figures that represent sleep and death. Here there is tragedy, and along with an exploration of greatness via human form and ideal warriorship, there's also an intellectual exploration of human emotion and the consequences of war. So there's a little bit about Athens to get you started. Corinth is another influential Greek polis, and Corinth also has a pretty distinct personality. Like Athens, Corinth began as an oligarchy and later converted to a polis that was governed by an assembly. In Corinth, democracy was less direct in that a council of 80 set the agenda for the assembly, but the people still had some say in what was discussed. Also, like Athens, they're defended by hoplites, so people are invested in defense. But Corinth's interest was not its military might or its intellectual development. Instead, they were into money. Corinth was a trading powerhouse. In fact, Athens and Corinth competed for trading superiority, and Corinth was a competitor because the polis controlled not one, but two seaports. This easy access to the sea was actually pretty lucrative for Corinth, and their arts show off the influences of the cultures with whom they traded, as well as their interest in luxury. See, Corinth was pretty wealthy, and their perfumes, pottery, and jewelry were sought after not just in Greece, but in Asia, Africa, and other parts of Europe as well. Their money brought them power and influence, and sometimes they were even a little messy, trying to start fights between other polis. I like to think of Corinth as sort of like the Kardashian family of ancient Greece. And we can see these Corinthian interests in their orientalized pottery. This picture was created in the age of colonization, a period when Greece was prosperous but running out of land, so they needed to branch out. And Corinth was well situated to explore styles and share their own styles in this era. This piece would likely have delivered olive oil to some distant land, and it might have returned with grain or been sold to some other Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Asian territory. Orientalized pottery depicted less humanity and instead incorporated floral designs and Eastern motifs. Check out the hybrid animals that are reminiscent of Mesopotamian regions to the east, or the lion heads that look a little like Chinese foo dogs. This pottery would also incorporate more colors, and they became some of the most desired after Greek exports, keeping Corinth well situated in the lap of luxury. But there's one polis whose interests were completely different, and that polis is Sparta. Sparta was located on the Laconian Peninsula, and their claim to fame is neither their intellectual nor their artistic prowess. Sparta was ruled by two kings, and they had a council of 28 elders made up of males over 60. They did have a general assembly, but there they only voted on laws proposed by elders. Debate was not allowed in the Spartan assembly. Instead, in Sparta, you contributed to your polis by contributing to the defense of the polis, and all Spartans were trained in warfare. Men, women, and children trained to serve, and men under 60 were conscripted for military service. So here, there's greater equality of the sexes, but that equality had a purpose. Women exercised freely outdoors, and they were meant to be fit and strong. Spartans believed that strong women produced strong offspring, and any offspring that were deformed or weak were left out to die. Those children that survived belonged to the state, and boys left the child's life at age 7 to begin training. By age 12, boys were taught to kill, and they would have already had to endure starvation, both skills that might be handy in battle. So, unlike other polis that were defended by hoplites, Spartans were career warriors. They kept slaves or helots to maintain the daily affairs while they spent their time training. Rather than seeing Spartan interests reflected in the arts, we see them reflected in the limited arts of Sparta. They didn't even write down their laws or history. Their traditions were preserved orally. Still, they continue to fascinate us, and there are words in use today that reference this polis. The word Spartan means bare or unadorned, like a college student's apartment. And the word laconic means using few words or no words. Feel free to use those words to impress your friends. And since we're on the subject of visual arts, it's important to note that there is a reflection of personality and region in architecture too. There are three major architectural orders that come from ancient Greece, and they each have a little something different to say. You don't need to remember all of their characteristics, but it might be handy to be able to tell them apart so you better understand the messages they're sending. The first is the Doric order, and it conveys a sense of strength and stoic dignity. This order features a plain capital, that's the top of the column, and it also has triglyphs and metopes in the frieze. The frieze is the part of the structure that runs perpendicular to the columns. In the Doric order, the columns are also plain and sturdy as they're uniform in width from top to bottom. Next is the Ionic order, and it's slightly more sophisticated and delicate. It features a scrolled capital, a column that is more slender, and a running frieze, which just means that the artwork on the frieze is continuous and not divided by triglyphs like it is in the Doric order. Last is the Corinthian order, and this order is probably more popular in ancient Rome than it is in ancient Greece. This order is ornate and fanciful. Some would even call it flashy, not unlike the polis from which it takes its name. It features fluted columns, or columns that get more slender towards the top. The capital is decorated with acanthus leaves, and in addition to the running frieze, this order throws in all sorts of other adornment. The message here is one of opulence and luxury. We can see some columns in action at this ancient temple of Hera. The temple is actually in Italy, so it evidences the Greek age of colonization, but it also shows us how they used architectural orders to send a message. Can you tell which order this is? Perhaps you noticed the plain capital, solid columns, and if you look closely, you can see evidence of where the temple also once had triglyphs and metopes. So if you guessed the Doric order, then you're right. Why do you think they chose that order for this temple? And what order might they have chosen if the temple was, say, for Aphrodite instead of Hera? Ancient Greece wasn't just good at expressing themselves via visual art, they were good at expressing themselves in literary arts too. And perhaps the most famous works of literature from ancient Greece are Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Remember, epics are long narrative poems that use figurative language to emphasize important points. And just like we learned in Mesopotamia, they can also tell us something of the culture's values and beliefs. Each of Homer's epics is made up of several shorter folk tales, and in ancient Greece, they were told by professional storytellers going from town to town telling stories for pay. The first written version was not recorded until the 2nd century BCE, so those bards were going around memorizing thousands of lines per poem. Each epic glorifies warfare, and each compares aspects of the epic heroes to something everyday Greeks might identify with to make them more memorable. For instance, Homer calls the hero of the Iliad swift footed Achilles, an epithet to emphasize that he is a superior warrior. And he calls the Odyssey's hero cunning Odysseus to emphasize his intelligence. The Iliad and the Odyssey also both feature the Trojan War, a famous battle that for a long time was assumed to be a myth. That is, until evidence of the actual war was found in the 1800s. Still, the mythological beginnings of the war are memorable and maybe a little revealing too. According to legend, the war all started because of a party. See, the party was supposed to be A-listers only, and Zeus did a good job with the invites, but he forgot to invite the goddess of discord, which turned out to be a huge mistake. Spurned, the goddess decided to get revenge by causing, you guessed it, discord. The goddess snuck into the party and left in plain sight a golden apple. On the apple was written, "For the fairest." Now, imagine a party full of vain and temperamental celebrities happening upon an apple that said, "For the hottest," and that's pretty much the scenario we have on our hands. The goddesses Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claimed that the apple was clearly meant for them, and they began to bicker. When the bickering gets out of hand, they turn to Zeus and ask him to choose. But Zeus is no dummy, so he pawns the chore off on a mortal, the Trojan prince Paris. Straight away, each of the goddesses attempts to bribe Paris for his vote. Athena offers him wisdom, Hera offers him power, and Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in all of the world. Which does he choose? Well, he's a Greek man, so he chooses love. But really, since he's a Greek man, Bomb Chicka Wawa is more likely his motivation. Aphrodite rewards him by giving him Helen, the most beautiful of all women, and he whisks her away to Troy. There's just one problem. Helen was already married to Menelaus, and Menelaus is a Spartan. So naturally, this kicks off the 10-year-long Trojan War. The Iliad picks up some years later in the middle of the war, and the trouble there starts when Menelaus' brother, Agamemnon, who's in charge of the Greek troops, is forced to give up a woman he's captured on a raid. In response, Agamemnon gets pissed and decides to reward himself by taking a woman from Achilles, Greece's star warrior. See, Achilles' mom dipped him in the river Styx when he was a baby, and this made him impervious to harm anywhere on his body except for on his heel, which is where she held him when she dunked him. So, for sure, he's an awesome warrior, but he's also proud and a bit of a brat. So, when his girl is taken away from him, he refuses to fight. He knows Agamemnon can't win without him, and he wants to make a point. Agamemnon eventually asks him to re-enter the battle, but Achilles refuses. And while he's being stubborn, his best friend Patroclus comes up with a secret plan. Patroclus sets out to boost troop morale by putting on Achilles' armor and heading out onto the battlefield. Plus, an appearance by Achilles might also scare the Trojan troops. The Greeks take heavy losses, and amid the melee, Patroclus is killed by Troy's greatest warrior, Prince Hector. When his best friend is killed, Achilles jumps into the fray and avenges him, killing Hector and exacting his revenge. But he doesn't stop there. He brings Hector's dead body before the Trojan king Priam, defiling it and dragging it through the dirt to add insult to injury. And this is also sacrilegious. Remember how the Greeks tried to take care of their dead. The story ends with King Priam sneaking into the Greek camp and humbly asking for his son's body back. The king and the warrior, both realizing what they've lost, grieve the consequences of their own pride. While it doesn't exactly have a happy ending, the Iliad does tell us a thing or two about Greek values. What happens when you succumb to rage and pride? What are the consequences of not being the best you can be? Remember, arete is important, and Achilles was not being the best warrior he could be. Perhaps more importantly, though, the epic explores a range of very human failings, human achievements, and human emotions, and the Greeks are very interested in these. The second epic, the Odyssey, is very different. It has all sorts of adventure, some great fairy tale elements, and it also has a happy ending. In this epic, Odysseus is returning home from the Trojan War. He's been away for 10 years fighting, and back home, his wife, Penelope, who is loyal and smart herself, is waiting for his return. See, back home, other dudes have been trying to take over Odysseus' kingdom. His wife is courted. People try to convince her that her husband is long dead, but she says she won't marry until she completes a burial shroud for her father in law. She has a plan. Each day she weaves some of the shroud. Each night she undoes her work. And for a while, this keeps her potential suitors at bay. Meanwhile, Odysseus is having a hell of a time getting home, and the journey ends up taking 10 friggin' years. Some of his trials include losing men because they got high at the island of the Lotus Eaters and decided they didn't want to go home anymore, getting detoured because they accidentally opened the god's gift of wind too early and got blown off course, having several men eaten by a cannibal king, getting captured by Circe and staying with her for a year as her lover, taking a side trip to the underworld, having ships lured into treacherous rocks by sirens, being attacked by sea beasts and whirlpools, and being held captive by the goddess Calypso for 7 years. My favorite distraction, though, is his encounter with the Cyclops. In this story, Odysseus and his men, tired and hungry, make a stop at the island of the Cyclops. There they find a cave stocked with food and drink, and they start to help themselves. The only trouble is the cave is home to Polyphemus, the Cyclops son of Poseidon, and he's just been away attending to his sheep. In case you didn't know, a Cyclops is a giant, one-eyed savage, and when he gets home and finds Odysseus and his men raiding his cave, he's pissed. Polyphemus rages and devours a few of the men, and to make matters worse, he rolls a giant stone in front of the door so none of them can escape. The next morning, Polyphemus leaves again to tend to his sheep, and Odysseus, trapped inside with his men, comes up with a plan. He and his men get to sharpening a giant stake they found in the cave, whittling it down to a good point and hiding it away when Polyphemus comes home. Then Odysseus starts to smooth talk the Cyclops. The two share some wine and they swap stories. And when Polyphemus asks his name, Odysseus replies, "Who, me? Why, I'm no one." Then, when the Cyclops is drunk and sleepy, Odysseus grabs his big old stake and jabs it right into the Cyclops' one eye. Polyphemus wakes up screaming, "No one stabbed me in the eye! Help! No one is trying to kill me!" And hearing his cries about no one, nobody comes to help. The next morning, when Polyphemus goes out to tend to his sheep again, Odysseus and his men tie themselves to the sheep's bellies, for the Cyclops, touching his sheep's back but unable to see, could not detect the men underneath. And all would have been well if Odysseus had left it alone, but no, he had to brag. When he and his men made it back to the ship, he shouted out to the Cyclops, "Ha ha, Polyphemus! My name is not No One. You've been bested by Odysseus." And that, friends, is how you piss off the sea god's kid and make your journey home a whole lot harder. He does finally make it home, though. When he gets there, he learns that Penelope, no longer able to fend off her suitors, has set up a contest, the winner of which will be her next husband. The contestants must use Odysseus's bow and arrow to shoot through 12 axes, something Odysseus could easily do. Odysseus sneaks into the games in disguise, wins the contest, kills his rivals, and they all live happily ever after. So, yeah, it's a good story, and it's entertaining too, but it still has some lessons to teach. In this one, we learn how important loyalty and nationalism are. Penelope is loyal, and Odysseus spends 10 years trying to get home, a place that he's proud of. Also, we learn that you really don't want to piss off the gods. And we learn that intelligence is just as important a virtue as good warriorship, as it serves to get Odysseus out of a good number of jams. Now, Greece has early non heroic writers too, and perhaps the most famous of these is Sappho. Sappho is a poet and a teacher from the island of Lesbos. She was surrounded by groups of women who came to Lesbos to finish their education, and some questioned her levels of closeness and affection with her students. Because of her poetry and relationship with her female students, we have derived the words sapphic and lesbian from her. And unlike Homer, Sappho doesn't wish to relay the feelings and actions of heroes, but instead she wants to relay the feelings and inner workings of the individual. And what's cool is that the feelings she relays are universal, so we can still relate to them today. Here is one of her poems. See if you can tell what she's talking about. He is more than a hero. He is a god in my eyes, the man who is allowed to sit beside you. He who listens intimately to the sweet murmur of your voice, the enticing laughter that makes my own heart beat fast. If I meet you suddenly, I can't speak. My tongue is broken. A thin flame runs under my skin. Seeing nothing, hearing only my own ears drumming, I drip with sweat. Trembling shakes my body, and I turn paler than dry grass. At such times, death is not far from me. What is she describing here? The sweet murmur, the heart beating fast, the sweating, and the inability to speak. What does that sound like to you? Have you ever felt this way when you tried to talk to someone you had a crush on? Also, who is she talking about? Who is the you in the poem? Don't be fooled. It's not the man she calls a hero. No, that man is only a hero, a god, because he's sitting beside her crush. Yep, Sappho is likely talking about a woman here, but universally, the crush feelings still work. And this was written over 2,600 years ago. It's also worth noting that music played an important role in ancient Greece. Plato and Aristotle give music great status in their writings, and they also give us some clues about how Greeks felt about music. The doctrine of ethos describes the power of music to affect people deeply, even to change their character. Do you agree? Could listening to certain music change the way you feel? Do you have a playlist for when you're feeling pumped and another for when you're feeling emo? If you do, then you know what these Greeks are talking about. Music at the time was primarily vocal and it was meant to accompany a narrative, but they made music that fit the sort of mood or character they wanted to elicit. And because of this power, Plato and Aristotle assert that music had a responsibility to only shape the very best character. Music was also featured in Greek mythology, and it was associated with the divine. In fact, the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice shows us just how influential music was. Orpheus was the greatest musician in all of the land, and he was madly in love with his wife, Eurydice. One day, when they were out frolicking in a meadow, Eurydice is chased by a satyr. In case you don't know, a satyr is a creature that is half man, half goat, sort of sex crazed and troublemaking. The satyr chases Eurydice into a pit of vipers where she is bitten and she dies. Orpheus is heartbroken. He cannot go on. He must go to the underworld and retrieve his wife. There's just one problem. He's not dead, and that's kind of a major requirement for entry into the underworld. Still, Orpheus, with his musical instrument in hand, sets out on his quest. First, he encounters Charon the ferryman, and he asks Charon for passage across the river Styx. Charon takes his job seriously, and he denies Orpheus's request. But when Orpheus plays his lyre, the ferryman is changed. He decides to grant Orpheus passage. Next, Orpheus encounters Cerberus, the three-headed dog beast that guards the underworld. Cerberus is snarling and growling. He won't let Orpheus pass. But then Orpheus plays some music for him, and the savage beast is soothed. Finally, Orpheus comes to Hades, god of the underworld, and he asks the dark god if he might see his wife and bring her home again. Hades is not a touchy-feely guy. He has no temples. He has only his duty to protect the sanctity of death. He denies Orpheus's request. But then Orpheus plays the lyre again, and Hades, god of the underworld, is moved to tears. Hades decides to give Orpheus what he wants, but there's one catch. Eurydice must follow Orpheus out of the underworld, and Orpheus must trust that Hades has kept his word. He must not look back to see if Eurydice is there. Orpheus thanks him and sets out to leave with his beloved. So there they are, trudging their way out of the underworld. And when they're almost home free, Eurydice becomes frightened. She calls out, "Orpheus," and he turns. And with that, she's whisked back down into the underworld, never to return. So yeah, that one does not have a happy ending, but it, like other narratives, relays something of Greek values and beliefs. Specifically, in this one, it relays the power of music to change character, as it even has the power to change the minds of the divine. And last but not least, there's important political and historical context taking shape in early Greece. Early Greece played around with different takes on politics in the Archaic period, and some of the most important experimentation took place in Athens. When the wealthy start to get ugly, or rather when they start to resemble something closer to today's definition of tyrants, the aristocrats attempt to seize control of the city, and the Athenians revolt against the oligarchy. The result is tremendous civil unrest, caused in large part by oral law and blood feud. It's not until Athens instates chief lawgivers that the city starts to find peace. One of these lawgivers is Draco. He was an early lawgiver who was meant to restore order by making laws and writing them down. The laws he wrote became official code, and they made it so the state would intervene in the case of theft, murder, blood feud, etc. The trouble was that many of Draco's laws were incredibly severe. So under Draco, if you killed your neighbor, you could be put to death. Also, if you beat up your neighbor, you could be put to death. And if you stole an apple from your neighbor, you guessed it, you could be put to death. Under Draco, even minor offenses could result in the death penalty, and maybe worse, citizens could be made slaves for failure to pay debts. But of course, this did not apply to aristocratic citizens. In the end, Draco's laws were so strict that we invented an adjective for over-the-top severity, and that word is draconian. Sometime later, Solon was chosen to be chief lawgiver, and things were better as he strove for balance in Athenian society. He reformed political practice and stopped the system of slavery for debt. He also created a citizen council and proposed topics for citizens to discuss. Under Solon, all classes could take part in the council, even the poor. So in a way, he gave us the first democracy. His system was later refined and made more bureaucratic by Cleisthenes, but really, rule by the people started here. And just when things started going well, along came the Persians. Just to be clear, the Persians aren't really all that bad at this time. In a good many ways, they're more advanced and more egalitarian than Greece, but Greeks paint them to be a pretty ugly enemy. So, yeah, Greece is doing well and getting attention from the Persians. Because of this, the Persians would like to join forces with Greece, adding them to an already flourishing territory. But as we know, the Greeks are prideful and they're not looking to be colonized. Instead, the Ionians start to mix it up with the Persians, rebelling against Persian takeover. And when Persia sends emissaries to Athens and Sparta, they don't get the best response. Athens sends the emissary back, declining their offer to join forces, and Sparta kills the emissary, sending a different kind of message altogether. In an effort to put Greece in its place, Darius the Great sends Persian troops to Marathon. It's a good strategy. Marathon is an open area, and Persians could use their horses there. Athens hears of the invasion, and it deploys hoplites and sends a runner to Sparta for help. Sparta declines to assist, though. It's a holy day for them, and their fighters are busy. Somehow, with a clever workaround for Persian horses and rearranged battalions, Athenians manage to defeat the Persians. When they win, they send a runner to announce victory. And the legend says that this runner traveled 26.2 miles, and this is why a marathon is just that length today. But this was just one battle. And when Darius dies, his son Xerxes plans to finish what his dad started. Greece knows he's coming, though, and they have a plan. Their plan is to steer the Persians to a narrow pass at Thermopylae. The pass is only 50 feet wide, and it will thin the line of invading Persians and make them easier to handle. Plus, this time the Spartans have sent 300 soldiers to help out. It's a good plan, or at least it's a good plan until someone shares it with the Persians and they find a way around the Greek trap. Knowing that they'll likely be defeated, most of the Greek troops retreat to defend their home polis. Only King Leonidas and 300 Spartans stay behind to fend off thousands of Persians. Leonidas and his men are killed. The Persians invade in earnest. They sack Athens, destroying temples and laying waste to Greek metropolises. But the Greeks are not done yet. In a new plan, Themistocles leads the Persians into a sea battle at the Bay of Salamis. The Athenian fleet attacks Xerxes with triremes and manages to decimate Xerxes' forces. Triremes are long and narrow with dozens of oarsmen, and they're especially good for ramming large Persian boats. The Persians lose at Salamis. They go home, and Greece celebrates its victory. After the Persian Wars, there is cooperation amongst the polis. After all, the Persians might return, and those Spartan troops, Athenian fleets, and Corinthian money sure did come in handy in those battles. They come together and form the Delian League, a coalition meant to defend Greece. And as part of their union, they set up a fund on the neutral island of Delos, just in case they need cash for war in the future. Also, after the war, Herodotus, or the father of history, writes about battles and triumphs, but this time he does it without mythological embellishment. His history is based on actual events, but it still makes note of personalities, for instance, claiming Xerxes lost because he had too much hubris. And here, too, you can see into the future of Greek sculpture. This Kretos boy statue was rescued from a dump where Athenians put all of the Acropolis debris after the Persians sacked the city. He's still reflecting that self-interest we saw before, but he's not stiff anymore. His pose is more natural, more human. And there's much more of this yet to come. But that is where we will end today. Until next time.